Screen is visible to you?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Also, I think last lecture we have already completed the chapter number 2. Yes? So today we are start chapter number 3, that is multiprocessor and multi-core operating system. Uh, have you heard about the word that multiprocessor or multi-core? What is it? Multiprocessor. कोई बता सकता है मुझे? आप बोलते हो मेरा कंप्यूटर मल्टी प्रोसेसर है या मल्टी कोर है. व्हाट इज दैट? हैव यू हर्ड अबाउट दिस पर्टिकुलर वर्ड मल्टी प्रोसेसर एंड मल्टी कोर? सुना है आपने? यस. हाँ नहीं बोलिए प्लीज. हैव यू एम आई ऑडिबल? शंकर.
Yes, sir.
यस. हैव यू हर्ड अबाउट दिस पर्टिकुलर वर्ड मल्टी प्रोसेसर और व्हाट इज मीन बाय मल्टी कोर? अगर नहीं सुना है तो नहीं बोलिए, हाँ सुना है तो बोलिए यस. मल्टी प्रोसेसर क्या होता है? आप बोलते हो ना मेरा कंप्यूटर मल्टी प्रोसेसर है या मल्टी कोर ऑपरेटिंग सिस्टम है मेरे कंप्यूटर की. ऐसा बोलते हो कुछ तो भी आप. ओके. आई थिंक यू हैव नॉट हर्ड अबाउट द मल्टी प्रोसेसर. यू डोंट नो व्हाट इज मीन बाय मल्टी प्रोसेसर. एम आई राइट? So, multiprocessor means what? At a single time, at one time, you can process the multiple processes. Means you can run the multiple processes in the main memory. That is a multiprocessor. And multi-core means what? On a CPU, on a single CPU, on a single processor, you have uh, you have the different processor, and at a single time that particular process is run on that particular core. Core is nothing but it is a small processor, and on that particular processor you can run the particular processes. That is a multi-core. So we will see what is a multi-core system. A processor that has more than one core is called multi-core processor. अभी जो प्रोसेसर होता है उसको एक से ज़्यादा कोर होते हैं, हम उसे मल्टी कोर प्रोसेसर कहेंगे. अभी कोर का मतलब क्या है? मीन्स कोर इज़ नथिंग बट इट इज़ अ प्रोसेसर, एंड उस प्रोसेसर में छोटा एक सीपीयू होता है, उसके हम एएलयू होता है, और वो क्या करता है एक प्रोसेस को जितने भी कोर है उसके ऊपर एग्जीक्यूट करता है. दैट इज़ अ मल्टी कोर प्रोसेसर. अगर आपका सिंगल कोर प्रोसेसर है, मीन्स यू हैव द सिंगल प्रोसेसर, and on that particular single processor you have the multi core. At that time, if your CPU, your computer is a single processor but you have the multi core, उस प्रोसेसर में कोर होते हैं. कोर का मतलब छोटे छोटे प्रोसेसर होते हैं. आपका कंप्यूटर सिंगल प्रोसेसर है बट मल्टी कोर है, तो एक प्रोसेसर के ऊपर आप ज़्यादा प्रोसेस क्या कर सकते हो, एग्जीक्यूट कर सकते हो. दैट इज़ अ मल्टी कोर. अंडरस्टूड? So while one with a single core is called a unicore processor or uniprocessor, or nowadays most of the system have the 4 cores, that is quad core, or 8 cores, that is octa core. So this core can individually read the execute program instruction, uh, giving the feel like computer system has a several processor, but in reality they are cores and not processors. अभी प्रोसेसर एक कोर है. कोर क्या काम करता है? मल्टी प्रोसेसर में आपको समझ में आ गया. मल्टी प्रोसेसर मीन्स क्या? आपके कंप्यूटर में बहुत सारे प्रोसेसर है, हम उसे कहेंगे मल्टी प्रोसेसर. अंडरस्टूड? यस ना बोलिए प्लीज।
Yes.
Yes.
हाँ बहुत सारे प्रोसेसर रहेंगे तो हम बोलेंगे मल्टी प्रोसेसर। अगर सिंगल प्रोसेसर है तो हम बोलेंगे यूनी प्रोसेसर, ठीक है, या सिंगल प्रोसेसर बोलेंगे, ठीक है। अभी क्या होता है, प्रोसेसर के ऊपर कोर होते हैं। इट में भी 4 कोर हो सकते हैं, 8 कोर हो सकते हैं। अगर 4 कोर रहेंगे तो हम बोलेंगे क्वाड कोर। आप मेरा प्रोसेसर क्वाड कर, इट इज़ अ यूनी प्रोसेसर क्वाड कोर। और आप कह सकते हो कि मेरा प्रोसेसर मल्टी प्रोसेसर नहीं है, सिंगल प्रोसेसर है, यूनी प्रोसेसर है, बट ऑक्टा कोर है। मीन्स व्हाट, आपका आपके पास प्रोसेसर एक ही है, बस उस प्रोसेसर में 8 कोर है। 8 कोर मीन्स व्हाट, छोटे छोटे प्रोसेसर है, वो क्या काम करते हैं, 8 कोर है, इसका मतलब आप एक साथ 8 प्रोसेस क्या कर सकते हो, रन कर सकते हो। दो योर कंप्यूटर इज uniprocessor, but you can run the 8 processor at a single time if you have the octa-core processor. Means unicore processor but it is octa-core, means single processor है आपका but उसमें 8 कोर है. So this course can individually read and execute the program instruction, and given feel like computer system has the several processor, but in reality that are the cores and not processors. So instruction can be the calculation, the data transferring in instruction, branch instruction. So processor can run instruction on the separate cores at the same time. So this increase the overall speed of the program and execution in the system. Thus, hit generated by the processor get reduced and increase the overall speed of the execution. So though you have the single processor, but you have the multiple multi-core on that particular processor, at that time the heat generated by that particular processor reduce and increase the overall speed of particular execution because of the multi-core. Your system have the multi-core. So multi-core systems support the multi-threading, parallel computing. Multi-core processors are widely used across the many application domains that include the embedded system, network, digital single processing. Also in the graphics, you may see the multi-core system that support the multi-threading and parallel computing. So efficient software algorithm that is being used for the implementation of the core to achieve the higher performance, and software that can run parallelly is preferred because we want to achieve the parallel execution with the help of multiple cores. अभी why there is a need of multi-core system? If you want to process the several processor at a single time, at that time you must have the multi-core processor. So if you have the multi-core processor, at that time you can achieve the parallel execution with the help of multiple core. You can run the multiple processors at a single time. So multi-core on chip architecture, if you see this particular diagram, you understood the multi-core. What is a multi-core? Uh, this is single core CPU chip. If you see this is a single core CPU, means that is single core, and this is a multi-core. सो यहाँ पे कितने कोर है, ऊपर एक ही कोर है, एंड इन सेकंड फिगर दैट इज 4 कोर्स, कोर 1, कोर 2, कोर 3, कोर 4. अभी ये होता है पूरा, ये जो आपको ये दिखाई दे रहा है, दिस इज अ यूर सिंगल कोर. अभी सिंगल कोर क्या होता है, ये आपका सीपीयू का चिप है. दिस मीन्स दिस इज यूर मेन सीपीयू चिप. ऑन दैट सीपीयू चिप you have the core. So core is nothing but it is a ALU unit, arithmetic logical unit. It execute the particular instruction, and it get the data from the registers file, and transfer the data to the register file, and you can connect this particular ALU and register file by the bus interface. So this is the system bus. And if you see the multi-core CPU chip, that is core 1, core 2, core 3, and core 4. Here you have the core 4, and the 4 core are connected with the bus interface. Bus is nothing but you can say it is a connector of different core. अभी यहाँ पे कितने कोर है? 4 कोर है एक प्रोसेसर. मल्टी कोर मीन्स यहाँ पे you have quad core. Understood?
Yes.
फिगर समझ में आ गए फिगर आपको? ये आपकी पूरी सीपीयू चिप है.
Yes.
ये सीपीयू चिप है पूरी.
Yes, sir.
और सीपीयू चिप के ऊपर आपका क्या
झालं
है?
ना.
सिंगल कोर
बघ
है.
राहिलंय का मी पुढं.
And that particular core is connected with the bus
आवाज
interface.
घ्या तुला आलता का?
So in multi-core CPU chip, you have the quad core processor. So here four core are is there on a particular CPU, and that particular core is connected by the bus interface. So this is single core and this is multi-core. So what is the advantages? So this core are usually integrated to the single IC, that is integrated circuit, or die onto the multiple dies, but in the single chip package, thus following allowing the higher cache coherency, and this system are the energy efficient since they allow the higher performance at the lower energy. So it takes the lower energy and the throughput is higher. Challenge is this, that is however, in additional overhead of writing the parallel code, it will have the less traffic, that is core integrated into the single chip, and will require the less time. So when when you have the multi-core, at that time you can process the different process, or you can execute the more process at a single time, so it will have the less traffic. So disadvantages, dual core processor do not work at the twice speed of the single processor. Abhi, suppose you have the dual cores, means you have the two core processor, but it will not work with the speed of single with the double speed of single processor, because they get only 60 to 80% more speed than the single processor. अगर आपके पास dual core है तभी भी उसका throughput है या 80% तक जाता है. Means if you have the single processor and you have the single processor with the dual core, but when you compare the speed of dual core and the single core with the process, means multi single core or unicore processor, but if you compare the speed, then the dual core processor have only more than 60 to 80% throughput if you compare with the single processor. So some operating system are still using the single core processors, and OS compile on the multi-core processor will run slightly slower on a single core processor. So जो ऑपरेटिंग सिस्टम मल्टी कोर के ऊपर कंपाइल होती है वो उसका स्पीड ज़्यादा रहेगा, और जो सिंगल कोर के ऊपर कंपाइल होती है उसका स्पीड क्या होगा? ऑब्वियसली थोड़ा सा कम हो जाएगा. Then we will see the what is a multiprocessor system. Multiprocessor means what? Two or more processor or CPUs present in the same computer and sharing the system bus memory or input output, that is called a multiprocessor system. एक कंप्यूटर में एक से ज़्यादा क्या होंगे? प्रोसेसर होंगे. हम उसको क्या बोलेंगे? मल्टी प्रोसेसर कहेंगे. और यूनी प्रोसेसर किसे बोलेंगे? जिस कंप्यूटर में खाली एक प्रोसेसर है उसको हम बोलेंगे यूनी प्रोसेसर. So that multiprocessor system sharing the system bus, share the memory, share the input and output, that is called a multiprocessor system. So it allows the parallel execution of different processor. So this system are reliable since failure of any single processor does not affect the other processor. If you have the multiprocessor, then failure of one single CPU, it will not affect the execution or the speed of execution of the particular processes. If one CPU fail, one processor fail, there is no problem. So the system is more reliable if you compare this particular multiprocessor system with the uniprocessor system. अब इसमें क्या होता है, अगर एक भी सीपीयू अगर ये होता है, एक भी प्रोसेसर अगर आपका फेल होता है, but there is another n number of CPU, n number of processor that will execute, they continue with the execution of the particular processors. A quad processor system can execute 4 processor at a time, while octa processor can execute the 8 processor at a time. So the memory and other resources may be shared or distributed among these particular processes. So if you see the multiprocessor system, that particular memory, single memory is sharing by the particular CPU, or you can say the processor. This is the multiprocessor architecture. And that particular processor are connected with this particular bus. So at a single time you can execute a, different processor at a single time. If you have the octa processor, then you can execute the 8 processor at a single time, and if you have the quad processor, then you can execute the 4 processors at a single time. That particular CPU or the processor share the same memory, share the same input output device, or sharing the same system bus. Have you seen this particular diagram? समझ में आता है ये डायग्राम? यस, बोलिए.
Yes, sir.
कितने सीपीयू यहाँ पे? How many processors are there? This CPU is nothing but these are the processors. Okay, you can say CPU or the processor. कितने प्रोसेसर है? How many processors are there in the figure? How many processors you can see?
There are n number of processors, sir.
There are n number of processors. So if octa processor is there, means how many processors are there? Octa processor. अगर आप बोलते हो मेरा कंप्यूटर octa processor है, what it means? या quad core है, what it means?
Octa processors means 8 processors are there.
8 processor, and quad processor means only 4 processors are there, means you can execute the 4 processor at a single time. So this is the multiprocessor system. And what is the advantages? Since more than one processor and they are working at the same time, that obviously you will have the throughput will get increased. If you have the multiprocessor, if you have the number of processor more than one in your cp, then throughput will get increased automatically. More reliable, because if a single cpu is failed, it does not affect the other cpu. The other cpu's execution continues, there means you can more reliable if you have the multi processor. It needs a little complex configuration. Parallel processing is there because you have the multiprocessor, so that at a single time you execute the number of processors, so it achieves throughput in the multiprocessing. So some of the disadvantage of multiprocessor, it will have the more traffic, though distance between two will require longer time. uh, throughput may get reduced in the shared resources system, where one processor using the same input output, then other processor has to wait for its turn. अभी क्या होता है, एक बार suppose there are 4 processor in your computer, and one processor given instruction to the input or output device to execute the instruction, and on the same time other processor want the input or output device. So at that time the second processor has to be wait, because first processor is executing is its instruction on a first that is input output device, so second processor has to be wait. So throughput may get reduced in the shared resources. So this is the disadvantage, as more than processor are working at a particular instance of a time. So coordination between these is very complex. So coordination between the multiprocessor is very complex. There is a complex architecture when we have to coordinate between the different processor. Understood? So these are some of the disadvantages. So we will see the difference between the multi-core and multiprocessor system. What is multi-core and what is multiprocessor? Multi-core, in multi-core, a single CPU or a processor with two or more independent processing unit called cores that are capable of reading and executing the program instruction. यहाँ पे एक ही CPU होता है but core ज़्यादा होते हैं. Means processor with two or more independent processing units, that is called cores. एक सीपीयू होता है, सिंगल प्रोसेसर होता है, बट उसके ऊपर कोर होते हैं. मीन्स यू हैव द स्मॉल मीन्स स्मॉल प्रोसेसर. And a multiprocessor a system with two or more CPUs that allow the simultaneous processing of the particular program. अभी multi-core में क्या होता है? It execute the single program faster, and in multiprocessor it execute the multiple program faster. अभी यहाँ पे एग्जीक्यूशन को होता है, अगर एक ही इंस्ट्रक्शन आपको ये करना है, एग्जीक्यूट करना है, बट वो इंस्ट्रक्शन क्या होती है, चारों कोर के ऊपर जाती है. थोड़ा यहाँ एक नंबर कोर पे, थोड़ा दो नंबर कोर पे, थोड़ा तीन नंबर कोर पे, थोड़ा चार नंबर कोर पे. सो इट एग्जीक्यूट द सिंगल प्रोग्राम faster if you have the multi-core but single processor. But in multi-processor, it execute the multiple program faster because particular instruction, particular process uh, execute on a particular processor. If you have the eight processor to be execute, then and if you have the octa processor, then you can execute that particular program faster. Since multi-core is not as reliable as a multiprocessor, it is not reliable. Multi-core is not reliable when you compare with the multiprocessor. And when you compare the multiprocessor with the multi-core, that multiprocessor is more reliable, since failure one CPU will not affect the other. Then it has less traffic. Multi-core has the less traffic, and the multiprocessor has the more traffic. So if you have the multi-core, it does not need to be configured, and if you have the multiprocessor, it need to be configured, and it have the somewhat, you can say, the little complex configuration, because having the communication between the processor is somewhat complex, and it need a little complex configuration while communicating one processor with the another processor in the multiprocessor computer. So it is in a multi-core, it is very cheaper than that is only single CPU is there, and that not require the multiple CPU support system. But while compare with the multiprocessor, it is expensive. That is a multiple or separate CPUs, separate processor that require the system that support the multiple processor as compared to the multi-core. So this is about the difference between the multi-core and a multiprocessor. Have you got this difference? Yes.
Yes, sir.
सबको समझ में आ गया? Multi-core and multiprocessor वापस से पढ़िए, then you can understood what is a multi-core and a multiprocessor. अभी मल्टी कोर में समझ में आ गया, सिंगल सीपीयू होता है, बट उसके अंदर टू और मोर इंडिपेंडेंट प्रोसेसिंग यूनिट होते हैं, उसे हम कोर कहते हैं. एक ही प्रोसेसर रहेगा, बट उसके अंदर छोटे छोटे कोर रहेंगे, वो भी एक प्रोसेसर की तरह काम करेंगे, दैट इज कोर्स दैट इज मल्टी कोर, हम उसे कह सकते हैं, दैट आर कैपेबल रीडिंग एंड एग्जीक्यूट द प्रोग्राम इंस्ट्रक्शन। वो प्रोग्राम की जो इंस्ट्रक्शन है वो रीड करते हैं और एग्जीक्यूट करते हैं, दैट इज अ मल्टी कोर। मीन्स आपका सीपीयू एक ही है, आपका प्रोसेसर एक ही है, बट उसके अंतर टू और मोर इंडिपेंडेंट प्रोसेसिंग यूनिट रहेंगे, दैट इज कोर। अंडरस्टूड? दैट इज मल्टी कोर। और मल्टी प्रोसेसर में बहुत सारे क्या होंगे आपके पास प्रोसेसर रहेंगे, दैट इज अ मल्टी प्रोसेसर। यहाँ पे मल्टी कोर में सिंगल रहेगा, बट उस सिंगल में ज़्यादा कोर रहेंगे। Then we are having the types of multiprocessor. So there are mainly two types, that is symmetric multiprocessor and asymmetric multiprocessor. So in symmetric multiprocessor, or in this particular type of system, each processor contains a similar copy of the operating system, and they all communicate with each other. So all the processors are in a peer to peer relationship, that is no master slave relationship exist between them. So an example of symmetric multiple system in the n core version of Unix for the Multimax computer. So each processor contains a similar copy of the operating system, and they all communicate with each other. सिमेट्रिक मल्टीप्रोसेसर मीन्स मल्टीप्रोसेसर में क्या रहेगा, हर प्रोसेसर के पास ऑपरेटिंग सिस्टम की कॉपी रहेगी, एंड दे ऑल कम्युनिकेट विथ ईच अदर, व्हाट इज टू बी एग्जीक्यूट नेक्स्ट, व्हाट इंस्ट्रक्शन इज टू बी एग्जीक्यूट नेक्स्ट, what page or what particular instructions should be swap in or swap out. So in symmetric multiprocessor, each processor contains the single copy of operating system, and continuously they are communicating with each other in a symmetric multiprocessors. What is asymmetric multiprocessor? An asymmetric system, each processor is given a predefined task. So there is no means you can not have the given instruction. One processor can not given the instruction to the another processor, or in this particular symmetric system, each processor is given a predefined task. There is a master processor that gives the instruction to all other processor. So यहाँ पे जो एक प्रोसेसर होता है वो मास्टर होता है, और वो दूसरे प्रोसेसर को क्या करता है, इंस्ट्रक्शन देता है, दैट इज असिमेट्रिक मल्टी प्रोसेसर। एंड असिमेट्रिक मल्टी प्रोसेसर सिस्टम कंटेन ए मास्टर स्लेव रिलेशनशिप। जो मेन होता है उसे कहेंगे मास्टर, और जो मास्टर जो अदर प्रोसेसर को इंस्ट्रक्शन देता है उसे कहेंगे स्लेव processor. So there is a master slave relationship. So asymmetric multiprocessor was the only type of multiprocessor available before a symmetric multiprocessor were created. Now also this is the cheaper option. So this is about the asymmetric multiprocessor. asymmetric multiprocessor में क्या होता है, मास्टर स्लेव रिलेशनशिप होता है। बहुत सारे प्रोसेसर होते हैं, एक होता है मास्टर, मीन्स मेन प्रोसेसर होता है। वो प्रोसेसर क्या होता है, दूसरे प्रोसेसर को क्या करता है, इंस्ट्रक्शन देता है, मीन्स कंटिन्यूसली गिविंग द इंस्ट्रक्शन टू द अदर प्रोसेसर इन अ सिमेट्रिक मल्टी प्रोसेसर। जैसे सिमेट्रिक में वो होता नहीं है। सिमेट्रिक में क्या होता है, सिमेट्रिक मल्टी प्रोसेसर में हर प्रोसेसर के पास ऑपरेटिंग सिस्टम की कॉपी होती है। इट विल नॉट हैव द रिलेशनशिप लाइक मास्टर एंड स्लेव। अंडरस्टूड? यस। समझ में आ गया सिमेट्रिक मल्टी प्रोसेसर एंड असिमेट्रिक मल्टी प्रोसेसर?
Yes, sir.
बाकी के स्टूडेंट यस और नो, एनी प्रॉब्लम to understand the symmetric multiprocessor or symmetric multiprocessor?
Yes, sir.
Sir.
Yes, Nikita.
Yes, sir.
Vaishnavi, Saili, Sanket,
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Pratiksha, Akanksha, are you there? So this is symmetric multiprocessor and asymmetric multiprocessor. So basic multi-core system memory sharing style क्या होती है? What is how the particular multi-core system share the single memory? So if you see uh, this particular diagram, a system with the multiple CPUs or multiple processor sharing the same main memory, that is called the multiprocessor. You have the multiple CPU, but it will share the main memory, that is called a multiprocessor. In a multiprocessor system, all the processors on the various CPUs share a unique logical address space which is mapped on a physical memory that can be distributed among the processor, and each process can read and write the data items simply using load and store operation, and process communication is through share memory. So it is the hardware that makes all the CPU access and use the same main memory. So this is an architecture model, simple and easy to use of use for the programming. So it can applied to a wide variety of problem that can be modeled as a set of tasks to execute in a parallel. So here the multiple processor is there, and that particular processor share the same memory. यहाँ पे देखिए आपके यहाँ पे प्रोसेसर है बहुत सारे, कितने प्रोसेसर दिखाई दे रहे हैं आपको यहाँ पे इस फिगर में? दैट इज ए, हाउ मेनी?
16, sir.
16. So in a multiprocessor system, all the processor on the various CPUs share the unique logical address space, so which is mapped on a physical memory that can be distributed among the processor. So each process can read and write the data atom simply using load and store operation. अभी देखिए यहाँ पे मल्टी प्रोसेसर क्या करता है, सिंगल शेयर मेमोरी क्या करता है, ये करता है, यूज करता है. Since all the CPUs share the address space, only a single instance on the operating system is required. So when a process terminates or goes into the waste state for whichever reason, the OS can look in the process table more precisely in the ready process queue for other process to be dispatched to the ideal CPU. अभी यहाँ पे क्या होता है देखिए, अगर ये प्रोसेसर है, ये एग्जीक्यूट हो रहा है, ये कुछ रीड कर रहा है या राइट कर रहा है यहाँ पे, ठीक है, इस जगह पे, इस पर्टिकुलर एड्रेस के ऊपर, इस पर्टिकुलर मेमोरी के ऊपर, बट somewhat some reason this particular process is stop or this particular process is suspend, so then it instruct to the other process that particular process can run on this particular space. Okay. So on the contrary, in a system with no shared memory, each CPU must have its own copy of the operating system, and the processor can only communicate through message passing. So the processor can pass the message. The basic issue in the shared memory multiprocessor system is memory itself. Since the larger the number of processors involved, the more difficult to work on the memory efficiently. So the problem is that there are number of processor and they have the same memory, so it made difficult to have the communication between the in between the processor. So the configuration is a little more complex in a shared memory. Understood? So the basic issue is shared memory multiprocessor system is memory. Since the larger the number of processors involved, the more difficult to work on the memory efficiently. So all the modern OS, that is Windows, Solaris, Linux, Mac operating system, support the semantic multiprocessing with a scheduler running on every processor. अभी ये सब सिमेट्रिक मल्टीप्रोसेसर को क्या करते हैं, सपोर्ट करते हैं. सो रेडी टू रन प्रोसेसर्स कैन बी inserted into a single queue, and that can be accessed by every scheduler. Alternatively, there can be a ready to run queue for each processor. आपको ये डायग्राम समझ में आ गई क्या? क्या होता है यहाँ पे देखिए, हर प्रोसेसर को क्या करता है, 16 प्रोसेसर है बट दे आर शेयरिंग द सेम मेमोरी. डायग्राम दिखाई दे रही है आप सबको?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
मल्टी कोर सिस्टम मेमोरी शेयरिंग स्टाइल. यहाँ पे एक ही मेमोरी है बट बहुत सारे प्रोसेसर, बहुत सारे कोर क्या कर रहे हैं, सिंगल मेमोरी एक्सेस कर रहे हैं. सो इन दिस पर्टिकुलर सिस्टम दैट पर्टिकुलर प्रोसेसेस हैज टू communicate to each other, and for the communication with each other the configuration is little more complex. So ready to run processors can be inserted into the single queue, and that can be accessed by the every scheduler. Alternatively, there can be a ready to run queue for each processor. So when a scheduler is activated in a processor, it chooses one of the ready to run processor and dispatch it on its processor with a single queue. So a distinct feature of a multiprocessor system is load balancing. So it is a useless having many CPUs in a system if processors are not distributed evenly among the cores. If you have the multi processor but your processor are not distributed evenly among the cores, then it is useless having the more CPUs or a more processor if that processor are not evenly distributed among the cores. So the more feature means distinct feature of multiprocessor is a load balancing. When there is a heavy load, when there is a more instruction and that want to be executed, at that time there must be execute each and every instruction, each and every process on a different course if you have the multi processors. So the main issue is for the load balancing, and with a single and a ready to run queue, load balancing is usually automatic, and if a processor is ideal, its scheduler will pick a processes from the shared queue and will start it on that processor. So modern operating system designed for the SMP, that is symmetric uh, you can say the multiprocessing, and often have a separate queue for each processor. So it will avoid the problem associated with the single queue. So there is an explicit mechanism for the load balancing by which process on the wait list of overloaded processor is moved to the queue of another and less loaded processor. So example of symmetric multiprocessor, that is Linux, that activated its load balancing scheme every 200 milliseconds, and whenever a processor queue is empty. So this is about the multi-core multi-processor memory sharing style, कैसे मेमोरी शेयर करते हैं. Quad core, octa core, hexa core. Understood? So यहाँ पे 16 प्रोसेसर है, 16 कोर्स है, और वो सिंगल मेमोरी क्या करते हैं, एक्सेस करते हैं. अगर कुछ प्रोसेस आता है और इवेंचुअली इसके ऊपर अगर डिस्ट्रीब्यूट नहीं होता है तो देर इज़ अ प्रॉब्लम. मल्टी प्रोसेसर होके मल्टी कोर होके उसका फायदा नहीं है. अंडरस्टूड? समझ में आ गया?
Yes, sir.
Yes, Akshay, are you there?
Yes, sir.
Avinash, Deepak.
Yes, sir.
So today we will stop here. Okay?
Okay, sir.
Okay.
और हेलो, आप जो मैंने अटेंडेंस ये किया है, शेयर किया है ग्रुप के ऊपर, उस पर ये करते जाओ.